407 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little know nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. These were the words of President Abraham Lincoln on November 19, 1863, as he dedicated the battlefield of Gettysburg as a new national cemetery. It was one of the most divided times in American history. This notion of creating a place where weapons could be dropped and humanity embraced would also be the key in the creation of the next national cemetery. The plot chosen was on a Virginia hillside overlooking the nation's capital. Today it is known as Arlington National Cemetery. Healing a Divided Nation, the birth of Arlington National Cemetery. In 1861, the bloodiest war in American history almost tore our nation apart. The American Civil War cost our nation 620,000 precious lives as families, neighbors, and states fought over the state rights and the spread of slavery. The history and lessons from this factious time remind us that though the circumstances leading up to the Civil War were complicated, we came out on the other side a better, stronger, and more united nation. America remains a battlefield, however, as today's conflicts and discords permeate society and prevent us from building on our commonalities. Not since the Civil War have we been more divided, as we continue to struggle with the concept that all men are created equal. Looking to Arlington, its rich history with the founding families and their difficult decisions can help us overcome the current animosity that divides America today. A beautiful Greek-style mansion perched on the Virginia hilltop was the home of George Washington Parke Custis's family. Custis's only surviving child, Mary Anna Randolph Custis, married her distant cousin and childhood friend, Robert Edward Lee. Robert E. Lee graduated from West Point in 1829 and would serve in the United States Engineering Corps for 30 years. Robert Lee was serving as a lieutenant colonel in Texas when the new Republican president, Abraham Lincoln, was elected on November 6, 1860. On December 20, 1860, South Carolina declared that it was seceding from the Union. 6 states followed, and in February 1861, when Texas seceded, Lee was ordered home to Arlington. With the firing on Fort Sumter by South Carolinian forces on April 12, 1861, the Civil War had officially begun. Virginia had not yet seceded, and 6 days later, Robert Lee reported to Washington, meeting with Lincoln's personal advisor, Francis Blair. Blair extended Lincoln's wish to promote Lee to the new Major General of the United States Army. Lee responded, "Mr. Blair, I look upon secession as anarchy. If I owned the 4 millions of slaves in the South, I would sacrifice them all to the Union. But how can I draw my sword upon Virginia, my native state?" Lee declined the offer. After returning to Arlington, news broke the next day that Virginia had decided on secession. Lee was now forced to choose the Union or Virginia. Robert E. Lee chose the South. Later, in a letter to his sister, Lee wrote, "With all my devotion to the Union and the feeling of loyalty and duty of an American citizen, I have not been able to make up my mind to raise my hand against my relatives, my children, my home. I have therefore resigned my commission in the Army, and save in defense of my native state, with a sincere hope that my poor service may never be needed, I hope I may never be called upon to draw my sword." 2 days later, Lee left to join the Virginia Army, and Mary Lee left only a month later. On May 2nd, Colonel Joseph Mansfield wrote, "I must remark that the President's house and department buildings in its vicinity are but 2.5 miles across the river from Arlington High Ground, where a battery of bombs and heavy guns, if established, could destroy the city." On May 24, 1861, the Union Army crossed into Virginia and took possession of the Arlington estate, establishing a military base. The ferocity of the war flooded Union hospitals. One Washington journalist wrote, "Maimed and wounded, soldiers arrived by hundreds as long as the waves of sorrow came streaming back from the fields of slaughter. They came groping, hobbling, and faltering, faint and so longing for rest that one's heart bled at the piteous sight. New burial grounds had to be found." Montgomery C. Meigs, the Union's quartermaster general, was tasked with finding a site. Meigs, a West Point graduate and former subordinate to Robert E. Lee, had a place in mind: Arlington. He felt betrayed by Robert E. Lee choosing the South. and wrote that no man who ever took the oath to support the Constitution and who has since actively engaged in rebellion in any civil or military station should escape without loss of all his goods and civil rights and expatriation. The leaders should be put formally out of the way, if possible, by sentence of death, executed if ever caught. Meiggs's recommendation of Arlington was approved, and he worked on interring both newly fallen soldiers and soldiers from other cemeteries. Over 20,000 servicemen, both Union and Confederate, were buried at the new Arlington National Cemetery. To guarantee its survival, Meiggs not only surrounded Mrs. Lee's rose garden with the graves of Union officers, he also erected a Civil War monument to unidentified soldiers from both sides by the mansion. When the war ended on April 9, 1865, reconciliation was the goal. The South rejoined the Union, but many lost their rights to vote and their property. None of the Lees would reside again at Arlington. They settled in Lexington, Virginia, until the general's death in 1870. Mary later died on November 5, 1873. In 1877, George Washington Custis Lee, son to Robert Lee, filed a lawsuit against the United States government in a Virginia state court. He argued that Arlington had been confiscated illegally and that the North imposed an unjust tax on Confederate lands, demanding that the tax be paid by the owners in person. Mary Custis Lee had sent her cousin to pay the tax for her due to illness. Her cousin was refused, and Arlington was seized and auctioned to the U.S. government. In 1879, a jury awarded Custis Lee the rights to Arlington. The government, however, appealed, and the case went to the Supreme Court. In 1882, the court found in favor of Custis Lee again. He had won back Arlington. Lee's home was now a burial ground, so he negotiated for the sale of Arlington back to the United States. He was paid $150,000 for the 1,100-acre site that now housed the cemetery, Freedman's Village, and 5 military bases. On May 14, 1883, George Washington Custis Lee officially signed over the title that guaranteed the National Cemetery's safety. We too can follow the example of the Lincoln and Lee families. As partisanship and bitterness threaten our civility and unity as Americans, we can look past our differences with humility. Arlington National Cemetery stands today as a beacon of hope to our divided nation, a symbol of triumph over the tragic Civil War. When tragedy strikes today and we bury one of our fallen heroes, we no longer discriminate with regards to rank, race, gender, economic status, or even identity. At Arlington, every patriot is laid to rest with respect, pride, and honor. And though America is still flawed, we have made progress in our pursuit of liberty and in the treatment of each other as equals. At Arlington, all are buried under the same flag, regardless of who they are. All men and women are treated equal, and because of this, Arlington is a place of healing and remembrance, a place where we honor our fallen brothers and sisters. But the work of Arlington is not finished. It must continue to inspire and teach the lessons of history. Understanding the tragedy of Arlington's inception is essential to understanding her triumph. And while the Civil War is remembered as the most divided and contentious time in our nation's history, we must also remember that it was during this time that many of today's most cherished military burial rites originated, such as taps, caissons, and rifle salutes. They have been integral in binding up our nation's wounds both yesterday and today. A feeling of reverence permeates Arlington National Cemetery. The care and discipline afforded every gravesite gives every American a chance to reflect on Arlington's unifying power. We all have great responsibilities and much to be grateful for, as citizens of the United States of America. I believe Abraham Lincoln was issuing a challenge to America both then and now when he concluded the Gettysburg Address, saying, "It is for us the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus so far nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they give the last full measure of devotion, that we here had resolved that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth."